Scott, it's whipping by us. This year's going just kind of as it is. We're in week 19 right now.
Shit.
Right?
What a long week though, dude. What a long week this was for the world.
Are you
right?
Is this like one of those weeks where you're elbow over elbow to the end?
Gosh, dang, just the things coming out of the news this week. I gotta tell you, whoo. And how about that stock market ride over the last 2 days? We get all Federal Reserve. We get all kinds of stuff going on now, don't we?
Yeah, this is the action we were all waiting for, right? We all didn't know which way was up in the pandemic. We were talking a lot about what would happen past pandemic and the opportunity for the roaring 20s.
Yep. And remember what I said. We got to pull up the podcast. Maybe it was like episode 2 or 3. You said to me, what would you give as business advice for 2022? What I say, hold on. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. That's exactly where we are. You can see it coming if you're paying attention to it, but the velocity and the tenacity and the surprises like Ukraine and Roe versus Wade. Whew. I mean, change. Talk about change. Just tons.
Yeah, this is when people talk about the new normal, I don't know if what they knew they were ordering was normal, but we're back to some things where COVID is not dominating the news. We're back to some things where economic falter or expected coming out of COVID isn't dominating the news, right? And so now we have other things dominating in the news, and it turns out we care a whole bunch more about things like Johnny Depp than we do about Ghislaine Maxwell, which is kind of odd to me, because I would have wished we would have had some of the same coverage for the other subject.
Yeah, you and me both. I would have liked to have watched every minute of that. If you haven't seen that Epstein special, that documentary, whatever, on Netflix, you're welcome, Netflix, for the plug. Wow. Just wow. Just wow.
Yeah, and it's so hard in a world that has that much challenge to continually kind of orient yourself towards that positive, that optimistic element, right?
Right.
And to really see what's possible. And that's what I hope we continue to bring here on Leadership Line of Sight.
Yep.
I think that we are dedicated to continuing to bring those examples, those people that have done things that some people are like, you can't do that. Like, I was talking to somebody last weekend and he was saying what billionaires do. And I asked him, how much time have you got to spend with any of them? Because I see them like whales, but I have a list now. And I got to say that the things that you're describing would probably be dispelled if you actually spend some time with one.
Yep.
You'll understand that though it may seem that they have a super yacht, they're on the back of the super yacht on a laptop, because what they're after isn't that. It's just like milestones of where they've been.
That's right.
And today we have somebody who is incredible for what she's done. Really, a lot of people during maternity leave, they look at it like a time to get acclimated to being a parent. But I have to say that some people find an incredible energy about them. And the things that Marguerite du Plessis, I think that I've said that close to correct, we're going to ask her specifically, did during her maternity leave was write a children's book. She is acclaimed for completing her master's in science writing from Johns Hopkins University. And she's been a senior clinical scientist for a decade. So talking to somebody like Marguerite as we go through COVID, who has a care for children, obviously her community, big at giving back. I don't think anybody writes a children's book when it's not about passion, but let's talk to her more about it. Marguerite, we're so excited to have you. Welcome.
Hi there. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's so good to have you here. I want to get some clarification. So first off, your name, Marguerite du Plessis. Am I close?
It's a silent S at the end.
Okay. All right. So now we got that correct, because people should definitely look you up. And one of the things that they should look up is your book. It's Crystal Palace. Is that right?
That's correct.
It's this was something that I just read with my girls. And what you were able to achieve was really to introduce young people to basically it would be the equivalent of sports heroes in science.
That's right. I'm really glad that's what you took away from it, because that's what I wanted it to be. And when I was going through the process with the publisher, I wanted them to animate it in a way that it was coming across that way, like fun little characters that our children could appreciate, but they're, reflective of what these guys actually look like. So, Einstein has crazy hair and Mary Curie has a bun in her hair, like all of her photos would have always looked like. And one of the characters wears a bow tie specifically because all of the photos I ever took of this guy, Edwin Hubble wears a bow tie. And so, they're cute, but they're science heroes that.
Yeah, so that's the thing that I really really landed with me, was making them real people is something that's very meaningful. To be like that was, that was somebody's like Uncle Albert.
Yeah.
Or the guy who stopped by the shop that your parents owned. Mm-hmm. There was more than just this genius. There's a person there.
Yeah, and they had their own story, right? So what's kind of interesting about the way that this came together is because it's a conversation. They end up telling their stories as if, they're just talking to Charlie and saying, it's like, hey, so I have this other friend that's also an astronomer that taught me this neat trick about how to find light in space. And that is how I figured out my big insight into how galaxies grow. But they're not teaching Charlie anything. They're just saying, it's like, hey, I have a neat little story to tell, like about something cool that a friend of mine told me. And like, wouldn't that be nice that all adults, all people, not just children, could have conversations with their friends and go like, hey, this is something interesting that I learned. Turns out it's really huge. Like, it changes the way we look at the world. But my friend, my uncle, my dad, they're all like people that influence our lives and they have meaningful relationships with. So they shouldn't be underestimated. Who's the new Mary Curie, Albert Einstein, Edwin Hubble in your life?
Yeah, that's something that, like for myself, I know that we have a mutual friend and I'm part of the RSMD team. And really, when we get to spend some time with some of the amazing people around us, like I remember them talking about meeting people like William Hurley, who has been changing how the U.S. views technology over the last 3 administrations. And when we go and meet all the people that do incredible changing things, the funnest thing is like going for dinner with them. I've met so many amazing people and they've shown me like magic, and it's been in a coffee shop.
Yeah, it's that it's an unscripted conversation, probably sometimes leads to the best outcomes, and it's often it's often true about like how sciencey things are discovered too. And I was the whole way this book came together is I was in a period where I was watching a lot of documentaries catered towards adults, that are supposed to tell you the history of how radium was discovered, or how polonium was discovered, or how a diesel engine was designed. And it's interesting, but it's catered for an adult. So what if you could tell a complex story to children as well? Just because it's a difficult concept doesn't mean that it has to be explained in a difficult way. Like, why can't the kids have a story about how bacteria was discovered for the first time? And if you think about it, it's relevant to our day and age, right? Like, bacteria, one of the characters in my book, it's about Robert Koch, and he's what they call the father of bacteriology. And where are we now? We live in a world where we actually are facing a pandemic. So isn't it kind of cool for a kid to see how that was historically discovered too? Like, that isn't a narrative that just needs to be kept for adult audiences because we think that only adults will understand.
But the problem is that the adults don't understand. Like, up until 2019, we all agreed if one of us is unresponsive, you should take them directly to the scientists. 2020, not so much.
Yeah.
See what I mean? That had to be something that was really frustrated for somebody who understands this so deeply, because I don't. So just to make it clear, your expertise is a senior clinical scientist, and you've worked in various therapeutic areas for biotech and pharmaceutical research for over a decade.
That's right.
And you have your master's in science writing at Johns Hopkins University for advanced academic programs.
That's great.
So going into a situation where suddenly we all had a science test, I imagine that you did better than others.
Well, it's interesting what people the interesting thing is what their emotional reaction is to it more than anything else, right? Because um, I make my bread and butter from analyzing how people at what side effects they get from taking new medications, and what the relationship of that is to studying medication. And you get into a situation like a pandemic with a new vaccine coming out, and people are very they actually forget that they're smart. They just remember that they are supposed to pick a side, whether they're for it or against it. They forget to think like, is this actually good for me? Am I taking my own responsibility for my healthcare? And you know in the end of the day, it's a much more emotional reaction for people. So somebody like me, you kind of have to take a step back and say the decisions that people are making, one way or the other, they're not geared towards how smart they really are. They're being driven by how emotional they are to the crisis they're facing.
Scott, when Marguerite just said people forget that they're smart, that really hit with me. I think that that's something I've heard similar things from you.
Yeah, and what's funny is that her book ties to her work. And the question I have for you, Marguerite, is if you were going to tell your story as a chapter in your book, how might you share that story with the readers of Crystal Palace?
um, I think I would like to be the booth in my book that says "Don't panic." um, there's the power of we live in a time where we have a lot of data being collected, and we analyze everything in our lives because it is available. But sometimes having all of that data kind of cripples the ability to make a good decision. If you have 80 pairs of jeans to pick from in the store, you're overwhelmed with the best choice for you. If you have too much data about what medical decision is good for you or not, then you're overwhelmed by what is the best decision for you. And there's this great British slogan from the First World War where they say, keep calm and carry on. And there's a lot of times during this pandemic where we that approach should have probably been followed more, that we just need to consider what information is valuable and what isn't, and just a little less peer pressure and a little bit more reality about what can fit into our worldview. So there needs to be if my storyline fits into my book, I would say there needs to be a scientist that it's almost like this psychology part of it that says, yeah, this is all great, and yes, all of these other scientists are doing great things, but don't let it overwhelm you. Like, still take it all with a grain of salt. In
the age of information, it seems that like insight is like the one-eyed man that's the king of the blind. That mindfulness. When you were going into pandemic as a new mother, how did you change from having a reaction to having a response?
It's a good question. I mean, it's actually it's a bigger insight that I've had to because of the work that I do, and I guess a bit of my personality, I tend to get a bit over involved and in whatever thing is currently going on in my life, and nothing has made me like stop in my tracks and say, I need to let this thing I'm obsessing about, I need to let it go and just focus on what my daughter needs now. So it was great in a pandemic setting, in like in anything else I would obsess about setting, to just have something that I'm mandatory supposed to care about more than this thing I'm obsessing about. And I found that it's been very healthy, like to just have something that forces me to walk away from crazy town.
Crazy town. You hear that, Taylor? Crazy town.
Well, I can't disagree with that, because the way that people were reacting to this was beyond any reasonable logic at all. And the amount of management we had to do for that side of it that we didn't expect. Like, we're trying to save everybody, and meanwhile people are like, hey, can I have some tissues? Like, I can't deal with this. And we're like, we need chaos, right?
Yeah.
The tissue people go at the back of the line.
When the banks failed in 2008, Michael Lewis, the famous author, he wrote a book called the colossal collapse of common sense. And he's an amazing investigative writer. And for someone who had spent many, many years in the mortgage-backed securities business, the mortgage business, and high levels of banking, what happened? Like, and then you read this book, you're like, oh, that's exactly what happened. And now I see where it started. He wrote another book about the pandemic called Premonition. And I highly recommend that everybody read that book. Because there was people just like Marguerite out there, gifted biological scientists who came together, and they knew it. They you just need to read the book. I don't want to take the whole show. I highly recommend the book Premonition, Michael Lewis. But here's the point of the book: is we knew, and we said what we knew. These people, and I think the state of California and some scientists holed up in a research center, and it met with so much bureaucracy, and it met with so much politics, given the administration we're talking about the United States here, right, Marguerite? So when you say crazy town, it's like there's a level of knowing. There's scientists like you and people like you that take the time to write the children's books, to influence children to know, to look at the normalcy of the people that changed the world, and you can change it too. So it feels to me like you're doing everything you can to uncrazy crazy town. How does that feel?
Well, I think what I want to do is just have a better conversation about it. Like I said earlier on, people are having very emotional reactions because they've had to pick one camp or the other. If somebody was in the hoard all the toilet paper camp, then it's hard to walk away from a decision you've had previously about, and then feeling compelled to justify that. But there's a something that I learned recently from a friend of mine who talks about, like, there's a difference between a debate and a dialogue. And a dialogue just starts the conversation about what is it that you want out of this experience or this item that you are stuck on versus what the other person wants. And it seems to me that a lot of conflict arises from not having a good dialogue. And this is often driven by the fact that people don't know what to talk about. Like I said, they forget that they're smart. They forget that they are equipped to have this conversation. They're allowed to be part of it. And the same goes for a kid, right? Like, they're part of what this book, I hope, does for at least one child is go, something now too, that you can participate in a conversation about something that you learned from this book as well. Or maybe from another book, but it doesn't take a big brain to have a big conversation.
Yeah, I think that's something that scares people is that they it's almost like they didn't want to participate in the logic because they felt unarmed, right? So they just participated in the emotion side of it.
Yeah. There's this thing that happens in when any drugs develop. There's this thing that happens where an event, a side effect, gets described by a patient as they have a mild fever, and the doctor hears it and they say, oh, fever is worsening. But now that doesn't mean anything to their pure scientists, so instead they describe it as pyrexia, which they then describe as an inflammatory event. And those are different levels of coding the event. And now suddenly, when the public gets exposed to how often this event has occurred in a population, they don't hear it's like, oh, there's a case of mild fever that occurred so many times. They hear some complicated word like pyrexia or inflammatory organism. They don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, it's like when they unpacked the vaccine and they were saying that it had this, and this in it. And it's like, yeah, it does. just because you don't know how that works doesn't mean it doesn't work. Like, you probably don't know that accidentally mixing some of the cleaners below your sink will kill you, but it will. Just like this will save you, you know?
Yeah, so there's I mean, and that's kind of part of it. It's like people aren't what I'm hoping is what I'm hoping will happen to us in the future, and I'm hoping will happen from this after our post-pandemic life is that we'll be able to have better conversations, and challenge where we're getting our information from too. Just because somebody smart tells you something doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it for the golden truth either. And I guess so. I was born and raised in South Africa, which is in an Afrikaans culture, which is kind of like Dutch style side breed, if you want to, and it's much more conservative. So I remember like a scenario in which we didn't really you don't challenge where you get your information from, and it wasn't. I'm very glad that I became a scientist in the backbone of scientific research is challenge the norm, and that's something I'm hoping comes away as bigger for the kids that are affected by a book like mine, and for even us as adults moving forward, is can we challenge the norm, and can we challenge where we're getting our information from, just applying a bit of logic. Is the vaccine good for you? Maybe, but it might also not be. And what's good for one person isn't necessarily good for another one. What's underneath your sink isn't necessarily the same thing as underneath somebody else's sink for very different reasons. Well, one, it doesn't have to be one rule for everybody. It's this situation all the time, and you just have to think for yourself and challenge that norm a bit, and we're just human. We all make mistakes and we all change our mind. We of course we change our mind, and it's okay to change our mind. And it's kind of sad to think that we live in a society where we hold each other accountable for every decision we've ever made. When you were a kid, you didn't like olives, and then suddenly you were a 34-year-old and of course I want an olive in my cocktail.
Well, when it comes down to it, why do we judge people on lack of evolution? Isn't intelligence, by definition, the ability to receive new information and reserve the right to change your mind?
Right, that's a good point. And why wouldn't you apply the same thing to, if you want your ability to change your mind, why wouldn't you give that to somebody else as well?
And all the greats were disruptive. The very few were accepted, during their time. I think that the one thing that we have succeeded at as a civilization is that we don't kill them anymore. Being somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, and Leonardo da Vinci's time meant living in fear all of the time.
Yeah, literally, right?
Yeah, he could write in mirror image with his left hand, and he wrote with ink that would dissolve when or would only appear when exposed to water. Because if he was talking about what he believed in measuring the world around him with others, they would kill him.
And that's kind of crazy, right? If you think about so if we tell our kids this story, it's once upon a time there was this crazy world we lived in where we killed people for having different opinions than we held. But that right now, I guess what I'm worried about is, are we still killing the ideas? Is it still, are we allowing enough of the good ideas to still surface, or is that still too scary?
Is that what cancel culture is? When we talk about the ability to essentially remove someone from the public discourse based on what they believe in, is that the same effect that you see? And where do you see that when it comes to the meritocracy of these ideas?
I think the thing that actually bothers me a bit about the cancel culture is that it's too broad sweeping. Right now you see some of it happening with everything Russian. I read this sort of funny news article where a restaurant was canceling their Moscow meals are no longer on the menu because they're not opposed to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. But I'm like, I I don't really see how those two things are connected. I mean,
Totally.
and for that matter, so if you were born Russian and you don't even live there anymore, you don't even speak Russian anymore, it's like you're immediately an outcast too.
I used to do this. I used to do competitive dog training for attack dogs. And a lot of that culture is from Germany, where the first police dogs in the world came from. And during the time after World War II, they actually couldn't call them German Shepherds. They called them Alsatians. And the reason is the same discrimination that we're seeing with anything that's like looks Russian. It's almost like people are like, no, I'm not a vodka drinker.
Yeah, it's like poor German Shepherds, poor Moscow mules.
Yeah, like Lex Friedman, like no, don't divide the teams like by accent or whether or not they like to wear Adidas tracksuits.
Yeah, so I think that's a little bit sad, that that's still happening, and it's not as violent maybe as it was in the Renaissance era, but it's still a little bit sad. And I think it's probably more sad now because we know better. We've seen, we would have thought by now, we would have learned a little bit from history. And like I said, one concept, one war is not defining everybody, and you can be against a particular portion of it. I mean, you can be against a war, which but still enjoy your other things of Russian culture. And you don't have to discontinue being friends of your Russian colleagues because they're associated with a country that made a decision that you don't believe in. And I'm hoping that people think about that. They think about what do you hope to achieve by cutting out ideas out of your universe?
Yeah, it's been a lot. That's been a lot of the discussion is who can talk about what, and that's something that we should be a little bit more open and transparent with, so that we can continue the conversations, so that people can have those evolution of ideas. I definitely think that that's the case. And Scott, I wonder if this fits. I was thinking about like the emotion of this war, and I have a real. I think that we have leaders of an age in the world where no future has a vision of them in it, and they are leading like that. These are very short-term, like the things that they would achieve are very short-term wins.
It goes back to what Marguerite said about challenging normal. There is no more normal. Our very existence and the evolution of our species in the coming years will be defined by our challenges to normal, whether it's climate change, Western medicine, whether it's geopolitics, financial markets. I can stop because I think everybody's starting to get my point. There's no more normal. We have evolved. There are complexities that we never, ever have dealt with at levels we've never dealt with them before. And it is incumbent on us to not only think about challenging normal, but it's actually our imperative to do so. So I think leaders are embracing those realities today. I also think that it's a lot easier to leave legacy today because it's all videoed and tweeted and Instagrammed. And so your time in the spotlight is dog years plus. If the spotlight's on you, it's on. And I think leaders are embracing that sort of level of trajectory into the wormholes of famous, and the president of Ukraine is a good example of that, right? And to your point to begin the show, so is Johnny Depp, right? They're just fleeting moments, but we have to capture them. We have to own them. We have to own our moments and meet our moments. That's what this is all about. I think that's what Marguerite is speaking to, and you as a child can meet your moment because these are normal people that have done extraordinary things. And guess what? You're normal too. But it's incumbent on those of us that are my age and your guys' age and all the way down that food chain right now. Don't just question normal. expect to question everything as if nothing is normal. It's imperative that we do so across the globe.
And then do you think that creates a nice new opportunity for something new to be created? I think of my own scenario, I unexpectedly found myself well, with a large chunk of time off. We were planning on having a kid, but then I ended up with a much longer maternity leave than I expected, and I, you know, got myself into a position where I previously didn't have any time. So I got to finally do something that I've been thinking about for years, which was write this children's book. And if it was ever going to turn into something that could be out in the real world for other to influence other people, it needed to be written first. And I've heard other pending children's authors ask me, like, how did it happen? Like, what was the process here? And it's always funny when I get this question that they go, I ask them first off, like, so what's your book about? And they're like, oh no, I haven't written it yet. I'm like, okay, yeah, well, you need to find like you need to write it first, And what I think is lovely about challenging your normal is that you create, like, if nothing is normal anymore, then why not try something new? Try to create a space in your life to do something that maybe didn't have room in your previous normal life.
Yeah, Scott. Now we gotcha.
I'll tell you what, you're dead on, and I say this to executives all the time. Hey, let's talk about emotions for a moment, and you can see the whole room go up. Here we go, right? And I'm like, fear of the unknown, and everyone's like, oh, yeah. Trepidation about who's going to stay in this company and who's going to leave this organization or your lives, for that matter, right? Right? Unhappiness, everyone, yeah. Overworked, yeah, and emotions. Okay, I'd like you to just stay with me. We're going to drop down the rabbit hole, and we're going to go down this dark tunnel. And it's cold. You can't see anything. It's eerie. And you're walking. It's cold. It's clammy. You're definitely under the earth. You're deep into the emotional place now. And there's a door. And you knock on it. You're scared. You don't know what's on the other side, but you knock on it. And this door creaks open, and there's a bright light. And this beautiful reflection of yourself from when you were a younger person says, "Hi, I'm Passion. Remember me?" It's finding what we're passionate about again. It's giving ourselves a place to think about our passions. Yours, you had a place, you wrote your children's book. For everybody out there, what I think I'm hearing you saying from a leadership perspective is passion. What's your passion? Find it and then write the book.
I got a question. Was the book a children's book before there was a child? Was there always going to be a book?
There was always going to be a book. So I'd lived in Edmonton, and between moving from Edmonton to Vancouver, I also had a little bit of time off in between jobs, and I was actually this is like when I started watching a lot of these science documentaries, and the idea first came to me. I'm maybe even like 6 years ago. I know that this is really interesting, and like a 7-8-year-old kid would probably find this interesting too. Like, not this documentary, this is like way too boring for an 8-year-old, but there's no reason why it couldn't be told in a way that they found it interesting. And it kind of like, I had a moment to think about it, like I could probably do this. Like I would need to spend time researching the history of all of this more, and thinking about the language that I needed to use. We needed to be very carefully picked because it needed to be suitable for that age group, and the art needed to be suitable for that age group. So, and I also wanted it to be fun. So I said it, in the 1920, and a story is only a story if there's a beginning and an end. So there needed to be that part of it as well. It can't just be a bunch of random ideas coming together. So, I had this idea, and I had this like notebook that then like slowly just sat there for years and years, because I did get back to working in my day job again. And as it goes, I had less time available, and I would only pick at it like every once in a while, and then slowly build these notes up a bit. And then when I had a large chunk of time off now again, for the maternity leave, I'm like, hey, all of that jazz that was filling my brain and making it unable for me to like really focus on this passion project had to sit to the side for a moment. So let's think about this again. Like and I still had the little notebook, right? So now I actually had the kid, and it seemed like the moment was right now. It's like this idea that's been festering for a year, and it has been sitting there slowly growing, is like finally ready to go breach through the ground and starts flowing and showing its first little green leaves. And then it kind of went much faster after that than I expected. So I finished writing it in like 6 months, and then submitted it to a couple of publishers, and it was rough. I mean, like it was it was a rough draft, and they really liked it. They liked it because it was an actual story, and it was like quirky, set in the times, and it was real. It was about actual things. And what they liked about it is that it had a real conversation with kids. Like it felt like somebody else could be the lead character. The lead character in this story is Charlie, and Charlie one day grows up to be a real scientist. But without me telling them this is what I wanted, the publisher got this. They came back with, I think any kid could feel like they're Charlie and walk into that exhibit and have that experience, had they lived in 1910.
Well, I think it's important that you know that my 2-year-old daughter's name is Charlie. That's her real name. So I'm excited to get this and read this to her at bedtime, because I'll say this to you about children's books. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of a cow jumping over a moon. That's kind of the extent to some of these kids' stories. And
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to reading her things that maybe that do have a beginning and an end. And it's not about going to bed, night, night, Charlie kind of stuff. So I think you've also given parents a tool to improve the intellectual time that they spend with children. I think there's a benefit there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And to have a conversation, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many, I hope I did it well, but there's so many ideas packed into this book, like science ideas, and I'm hoping like they come back and they go like, what was that thing you told me about last night, Daddy,
Right.
about the diesel engine? Does our car have a diesel engine?
Yes.
Who doesn't want to have that conversation with their kid instead of like,
Yes.
yeah, oh look, a red balloon, like just in my storybook.
Yes. Yes.
I find it interesting when people break down great knowledge and make it accessible.
Yeah.
Like one of the most beautiful things I've ever read was Stephen Hawking's In a Brief History of Everything. He explains the theory of relativity as if it's two people playing catch on a train, and talks about being relative on the train and then being someone off the train that is suddenly introduced to the baseball as it breaks a window. So you could see how these types of things have relationships, and it really brought it down. I've also got some books from Chris Ferry, who writes a series for babies, where he meets with world-class experts. Actually, I mentioned him earlier, William Worley.
Yeah.
So they wrote quantum computing for babies.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the series. It's very cute.
Oh, I love it. And it's so adorable to hear your like 2-year-old talk about qubits, and I thought that was a great way to introduce these type of topics, and the way that you're turning the things into people. That was the element that I think that young minds really get is that it's the people. It's not just the idea or the concept alone, right? Because these concepts existed in the minds of other people that were never able to action them. There's talent in every basement and garage across the country, but most of it stays there and dies there.
Yes, absolutely. Like, talent isn't where it begins and ends. It's much harder to turn that idea into reality. So there's this controversial story from South Africa where the first heart surgery was ever done in South Africa. But the guy who gets credit for it wasn't actually the first guy who ever did a heart surgery successfully, but the very first guy who did it didn't follow through on it and didn't actually find a patient, didn't complete the story, you know. So there's lots of situations like that, and science is riddled with it, you know, like the guy who's upset because he had the idea first but he didn't publish it. And okay, yes, you had it first, you should have published it. You know, there's this great book also about from a theoretical physicist called Frank Close that talks about that has lots of like physics history in it, and so much of that book is about this the other guy you didn't know about that came up with whatever physics concept first. And like, that's interesting to kind of like see those dots connect, and you feel bad for the guy who didn't get credit for his idea. But if you don't push to get it out there, you know, if you never apply for the job you wanted, and you can't complain that you didn't get it. If you don't publish the work that you wrote, then you can't complain that somebody else had the same idea and then got published.
Yeah, on the other side of that, though, those people that don't publish it, they rob the rest of us. Like what they wanted was the appreciation of the knowledge, but they didn't choose to share it. You know, like patents and things do lock some things up. But on the other hand, is look how it benefits society. Look how civilization is able to step forward and people are able to stand on the shoulders of others. Like there's a reason for this. There's a reason that we reward the people that bring us the greatest fruit.
Yeah, and it might not be the greatest one, but it's just, you have to start somewhere, you know. Like our first computers that ever came out weren't exactly great, but they got us into the computing age, you know, and that kind of thing happens all the time. Like you have to start off with something that's really not good at all just to get the process going. And sometimes the first guy might have the vision to turn it into something fantastic, but it takes so long to bring it out there that it never actually comes to fruition.
And the thing that we don't see in science history is what we were going through, right? Like Spanish flu, Black Plague. You know how far back we got pushed before we actually started to like fund things that will lead to technology after that as a group. Like we had to recover. And right now, like Scott sends me over some stories each week that we like to run through. And what we're seeing is the world battling with inflation. I know as somebody who has a great tech interest that during COVID, there was a lot of concern about technology that wasn't about COVID being funded at all. Scott, what do you see when you see April is the worst month in the Nasdaq?
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of schools of thought, and it's a confluence of many things. But one of the things that we have to realize is that these were growth stocks. If you look at that chart, you're looking at companies that were under the assumption of heavy and fast growth, and so they're given growth forecasts, growth company forecasts. These are not growth companies. Look at that list. Those are utility companies. Look closely at that list. Those companies have created new utilities that have attached their tentacles to us that we pay for monthly, that we pay for by subscription, that we pay for in an automobile, a utility, the delivery of our goods and services with efficiency and effectiveness. Amazon, Meta Platforms, advertising platform, a utility for people to communicate. Netflix, a utility to receive content. So we're seeing a reset now in the way we value the growth of these companies. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of this at the fund manager level and at the big movement of blocks of shares level. And the reason we're seeing that is because news like Netflix losing subscribers. Well, that's the maturing of an organization. That's the maturing of a company. They don't always go up at high multiples. It means the growth phase of the enterprise is over, right? So this capital will shift more towards Marguerite's world, and in Marguerite's world, bringing new technologies of medicines to market, bringing new applications of medicine, healthcare, the amount of work that needs to be done. So I think we're starting to see some shift in some sectors here, and for good reason, and to be deployed in good ways.
I think that's an interesting take. When you take a look at like economic performance as somebody who is in the science community, is this something that occupies a lot of your mind space?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, in the last couple of years, it's almost as if there's been a bit of a pause on what people were willing to try and willing to invest in. Like they were just a bit less risky, you know. They're from friends that I have that have been trying to push their ideas on the world. They say like their reception just hasn't been as good as it has been in the preceding times, and there's been a lot more um call out for a safety net, you know, like less they're getting less exposure than they did before. And it has been a little bit sad, you know, like there's been so much focus on one conversation. But now what's happening, like it sounds like in the last 6 months is, you know, it's almost as if society has just gotten a little bit tired of one narrative, and they need to like there's a reason why Netflix is suddenly such an interesting story, you know, where maybe it wouldn't have been 2 years ago. Like, so we at some point in time, people just want to hear something else other than like the pandemic news. And whether or not the situation has changed is not relevant to the point that I'm thinking of. It's more that the time just seems right, you know, like one conversation has been saturated, one set of ideas has been saturated, and now it's a good time to start thinking about what else is available, like what else can grow. And it's not necessarily everything that as you know, is it maybe subscription driven, and may just be things that are more novel. It forges a new path.
So, Scott, you were saying that other things are getting attention, right? And I also see a lot of changes here. So Netflix obviously raised their prices. They're seeing a lot of competition, but they're also, Netflix and chill was the theme song of COVID, right? Like when you take a look at how much attention they garnered and the fact that they want to charge more for that now, that didn't really surprise me. When I take a look at Meta Platforms, huge announcements from that company about going a different direction, and so many people just got off board, right? And that's natural when a company basically says we're going to do a restart up as one of the leading companies in the world, just never heard of before. You know, we see NVIDIA. NVIDIA was, they make graphics cards, and graphics cards were like, they were worth like Bitcoin during the pandemic, right? Everybody is mining with them. And this is something that a trend may be changing as a lot of people are now out and about. Things are changing that way. Tesla, obviously their founder making very large changes recently, but this stock has been kind of up and down and everywhere for a while. Alphabet is what the new name of Google is. And again, when you take a look at cost per lead as a marketer, during the pandemic was low for everybody because a lot of people panicked and pulled their money out. So they weren't marketing the same way, and also way higher screen time. Huge amounts of screen time for the average person, and that's what made marketing, people like going deep into marketing. I'm not surprised that changed. But when it comes down to Microsoft and Apple as well, I imagine that when we were forced to stay in our homes, people bought way more electronics. And in a case where chipsets were hard to find, they were kind of having trouble meeting that demand. And I'm wondering if they're past that ebb and flow state now. So I have kind of like, when I see this list, I'm like, man, there's a lot of things that have either been affected by their own decisions, or there's a lot of pandemic effect here.
And absolutely, I agree with you 100%. All of those markets have matured. The market itself was COVID. And so now we're back in a different market, and growth changes, and growth companies and opportunities for growth changes. So we're going to look at those as utility companies and less like growth companies now.
So when you see the next steps, then, like I know that since Russian oil costs rubles, oil is something that a lot of people are focused on right now. And I happen to live in the little Texas of Canada. For our American viewers, we are hardworking farm folk in the oil industry. And that's something that's very interesting here, and is very likely going to affect net migration patterns. That's also that primary industry. That's something that we have not seen job creation in, at least up north, for quite some time. So is that going to be a sign of the times, do you think?
Could be. when your markets are driven by supply and demand, it's easy to forecast. It's easy to understand. When your markets are driven by geopolitical forces worldwide, tugging and towing and pushing and pulling and sanctioning, it's a little bit more complex. It's very hard to invest in a commodity extraction business when the gyration in the price or the potential gyration in the price is beyond tolerance. So it's a very capital intensive decision to tap a new well or to increase production and those kind of things. And so where do you go for capital? Well, you go to the lending institutions, and the lending institutions line of sight on the price of oil is just like the oil companies. It's ask me tomorrow. Well, you can't make decisions like that in the capital intensive. So I think we've got to really understand where the rebalancing act is with Russian oil. And if those sanctions actually hold and the EU actually does ban, and we do continue in the United States to release strategic reserves, and OPEC decides to pull back in the fall like they normally do, well, those are all constricting events in the marketplace, which will raise the price of oil. So if we're going to see that sort of tug there, and then you might see some growth into the industry itself.
That's interesting. When it comes down to like any effect that plays on your side, Marguerite, when you're taking a look at the next things that are funded as far as like science, is there anything that you said wasn't getting a good reception during COVID that you might be excited may get a different reception post-COVID?
Well, what I'm actually more curious about is what's going to happen in this from a stock market perspective is when the pandemic was going on, there were companies like Starbucks and Nike that just didn't do well. Like they suffered due to people just not having reason to interact with them as much as they did before. And those are big players, but that also happened to smaller companies, and their impact was like some of those companies suffered just because if you think about a Starbucks scenario, people weren't going into the office and then weren't stopping there to get their daily coffee anymore. There are tons of companies in that scenario. And what I'm actually curious to see now is who are those small players who's suddenly going to get some airtime because the people are literally getting out of their houses again and trying new things. And I saw, I live in BC, and where I live on the side of a mountain, so I get to be a very outdoorsy person. So I'm probably a bit more hypersensitive to it. But I saw some hiking and outdoors equipment that suddenly got funded by this company called Bivy, and they basically have this design of like a sleeping bag that can serve as like an at-home quilt type of shelter situation in and by itself. And they just are finally getting traction. But if you read the company history, they've been in play for a really long time. And that's like one small example. But the only reason why people are paying attention now is because they're starting to get out of their bubble again. They're starting to like think, what is it again? What are all of these things that I was interested in again before I went into the bubble? And it doesn't surprise me that, from a banking perspective, that the same thing is happening. They're seeing there's now the market isn't so stressed. They can start investing again in companies that have growth opportunities, not just that are stable. They don't have to brace for an oncoming storm. They can start trying out the smaller rivers of the journey.
See, I want to call it out now. I want to call it, this is going to be the era of entrepreneurship. My kids are way more likely to have a gig than a job. Start your own business, Great Reservation. Yeah, keep going. Be the next one. I really am passionate about this, especially small family businesses. You guys that want to start in retail, you guys that want to start in these sectors that we've seen receding, like Marguerite was describing, where the public didn't have interactions. If you view yourself as someone who wants to make an experiential business, get going. it is the time to get going, because this next period of time, provided that we don't experience more disruption, is really going to be where you can seize that. You're already ready for a change if you've lost momentum, right?
Yeah,
But
and
man, come outside. It's awesome out here.
and now for our listeners, how do you get started? Like, how do you get started? What gets you all? How do you get leaning over that couch to that coffee table and be like, all right, I'm going to start this.
Yeah.
Right? It's two things: intent and write it down. Just write it down. 2 pages. What is it? What problem does it solve? How do I make money doing it? 2 pages. That's it. Start right there and then look at it. And then talk to your friends after they sign NDAs about it, if it's a good one. Right? But start talking about it.
You know, like the hurdles to starting something now is less than it was 20 years ago. You know, like age of the internet. Thank you very much. You want to learn how to start up a company? There's probably something online. You want to learn how to write a book? There's probably something online. You know.
But that's the truth.
I finished most of my master's degree because the age of the internet allowed the situation, so pandemic didn't interrupt it. I got to submit a book to a publisher without having to physically go to their office and drop it off in an editorial office. I just emailed it in. The hurdles are smaller, and there's somebody who's maybe done it before or something like it before that you can kind of take a cue from. But to speak to Scott's point, you have to actually get off of your coffee table, get away from your coffee table, get off your couch and actually slowly start moving it. And what I see with new people coming into my industry, most mistake they make a lot. And what I'm hoping I can teach at least my daughter not to do is don't be intimidated by all the hurdles between now and where you want to be. Just, it's like climbing a mountain. Just take it one step at a time. You'll eventually get to the top, but you need to start that hike somewhere.
And I'll tell you this right now. I mean, 100% this is true. There are hurdles. And they all are in exactly the same place, right between your ears. All the hurdles are here. There's no hurdles out there, because those are opportunities to have a conversation, to learn from the no's, to get that much closer to the end of the rainbow. Everything else in here, the internet, put the idea out there, share the idea in a forum, get people's feedback, start crowdfunding, start Kickstarter, do something. Just write it down with intent. Answer those 3 questions. Remember, the hurdles are in here.
Before I had my book published, my mentor had said to me, just brace yourself for decorating your bathroom wall with all the rejections that will come. And it's got nothing to do with your talent or your skill set. It's just brace yourself for no, because there will be no's. But if you don't let that define the process, because what you take away from it, that emotion you have to know is just, it's just internalized. So you said it's the thing in between your head, and that's what she meant too. It's just a thing between your head. So get to a point in your life where no doesn't suck so much, where no becomes an opportunity. At least you learn something from it.
Do you know where the only difference between an entrepreneur and a non-entrepreneur? There's only one difference. Do you know what it is? A non-entrepreneur says if, an entrepreneur says when. It's never if, it's when.
See, I find that most people that are looking to make this change, I think that they need to take a better look at their current situation. So for me, if I wanted to change things about my physical appearance, well, let's take a good look. Strip her down, stand in front of a big full-length mirror. Now you're going to be inspired to change, right? And that's because there's a change index. The pain of change has to be less than the pain you're in. And what top producers tend to do is associate pain with where they are and pleasure with where they're going. And the difference that I see between entrepreneurs and not is that people that aren't entrepreneurs say, what happens if I fail? And that's not scarier than what happens if I don't try, right? But nothing's scarier than me. I'm relentless. And so the thought of looking myself in the mirror, not having tried, well, I'll fail 1 billion times before I do that.
Yeah. And never, ever forget that the journey is the destination. Having the book published and having it, all those moments that are happening for you, Marguerite, that's wonderful. But the
Absolutely.
journey that you have when you wrote that book, right? That's the destination.
Yeah, I
Nobody
mean,
has like you do.
I'm so happy it got published and that it is getting some traction in the world. But when it was done, and I was just so happy that it was there. Like I had this idea in my head that finally turned into a thing, like a finalized book that I could then share with people. It was no longer me just talking about like, oh, I have this idea. I could potentially one day write a children's book, and it actually happened. And what like I said, I'm happy it's published, but I would. Not to be cute, but it was almost, I was happier when I just finished it.
A friend of mine finished a book last year, and it's a long read. It's a significantly thick, I guess, nonfiction book. And he was saying that by the time he was finished writing that book, he no longer wanted to write text messages. Like it was just so much of one thing under pressure, publishers involved, that it ended up being this thing where it kind of robbed him of that experience for a little while. I'm sure he'll recover just like most other ones do. And then they say, I'm ready to get hurt again.
Yeah, because the memory of the pain fades, right? And,
Right.
right.
Hey,
is there
Marguerite,
in there?
Sorry, second.
Is there another book in there?
Oh, so good question. So I was thinking for the next version, to delve a little bit deeper into history, into like the time where Ada Lovelace time, where the Babbage machine was the first idea of the computer. And kind of, it'll be different characters, obviously way before Charlie's time, but something kind of similar, where great ideas can come together.
That's fantastic. And that's definitely something that we want to see more of. I think that it's the reception that you got from the first people that you approached is a sign of what you're tapping into. And we need more people that are willing to talk to us about what happens so that we maybe get a better understanding and we're more equipped to deal with things that are related to that in the future. So I'm glad that you're helping introduce my little girls to the sports stars of science. I think that really, I know on my vision board, there's some incredible CEOs. There's some leaders that I'm like, man, this person's culture is what I want. And this person's execution and this person's ability to make high level, meaningful deals. These are the people that I want to travel in their footsteps. And I'm sure that there's also going to be the same, but I enjoyed glimpsing into your world. Thank you for sharing it with me.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm glad that we get to have an opportunity to talk about how something like this can have a much more meaningful impact. It's not just like it's not just a story that came together. It's a story that can be somebody else's story as well.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership Line of Sight. This has been Marguerite du Plessis. And she is a children's book author and also a senior clinical scientist that just did an amazing job of sharing her world through the eyes of science history in her book, Crystal Palace, that you can easily find online. Great book. Share it with your children. My name is Taylor. I am the marketing strategist at Gravidia. I'm looking for the way to change the way that we talk to each other and change the way that businesses communicate with their clients. And I'm always here with Scott Connors. Scott is the Chief Change Officer of Crankset Group, helping leaders make those decisions, look past the fear, and make the changes that will help them align with this future that we see as ever-changing. Leadership Line of Sight. You can find us everywhere, and this episode is being live streamed now and will be released on all the places that you hear podcasts within the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Marguerite.